Minnesota is a state shaped by water, stone, and ice. More than 10,000 lakes shimmer across the landscape, their shorelines winding through dense forest, rocky bluffs, and quiet towns where everyone seems to know everyone else's name. The Mississippi River begins here as a narrow stream before carving its way south across the continent. Along the North Shore, ancient cliffs rise above the cold waters of Lake Superior, while glaciers, long ago, left behind the rolling hills, wetlands, and endless stretches of wilderness that define much of the state today. It's a place of remarkable beauty, but beneath that beauty are stories that refuse to rest, disappearances that began on lonely highways, murders that shattered small communities, people who stepped out into the Minnesota landscape and were never seen again. Decades later, families are still searching for answers. Investigators are still chasing leads, and questions remain where certainty should be. Tonight, we're traveling across the land of 10,000 lakes to explore 12 of Minnesota's most haunting unsolved mysteries. This is 12 Unsolved, Minnesota. Welcome back to the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you're joining me for another episode of 12 Unsolved. We begin our first case in Painesville in 1944. On September 5th, 1944, the little town of Painesville was settling into another Minnesota autumn. 6-year-old Victor Jackie Thiel was excited to begin first grade. So excited, in fact, that he could barely touch his breakfast that morning. Like countless children before him, he headed off to school carrying a mix of nerves, curiosity, and anticipation. It was only a half-day session. At 11:30, the students were dismissed to return home. Jackie wasn't supposed to walk home alone. His mother had sent a note explaining that one of his older brothers would be coming to pick him up. But somewhere between home and the classroom, that message appears to have been lost. When the teacher asked Jackie if he knew the way home, he confidently said yes. It was the last confirmed sighting of him. When Jackie failed to return home, the sheriff was quickly notified, and soon much of Painesville joined the search. Farmers combed through fields and outbuildings. Shopkeepers checked every corner of their stores. Neighbors searched roadsides, ditches, and wooded areas. Bloodhounds were brought in and picked up Jackie's trail. The dogs followed his scent west through town toward Highway 23. Then, without explanation, the trail simply ended. Years later, rumors and possible sightings began to surface. In the 1960s, one of Jackie's sisters received a letter from a former Painesville teacher. The woman claimed she had encountered a man disembarking from a Navy ship who strongly resembled Jackie. According to the story, he identified himself as Jackie Thiel and said he had been adopted. But nothing else came of that possible lead. Then, in the 1980s, another sister heard a different account. A man had reportedly visited a local cafe in Painesville searching for his family. The story claimed he left disappointed after failing to find any Thiels listed in the telephone directory. But there was one problem. The Thiel family was listed in the phone book at the time, casting doubt on the entire tale. Were these genuine encounters with a man searching for the family he had lost? Or were they simply stories born from decades of unanswered questions and lingering hope? More than 80 years later, no one knows what happened to Jackie after he left school on that September afternoon. If you have any information about his case, please contact the Painesville Police Department at 320-243-7346. On the morning of August 23rd, 1973, Mary Chagnon left her home in Duluth to travel to the Twin Cities, where she was scheduled to speak at a workshop focused on women's issues. Sometime between 9 and 10 a.m., she climbed into the family car and drove away, but she never arrived. When Mary failed to appear at her speaking engagement, Concern quickly became alarm. Days later, her vehicle was discovered abandoned in a Minneapolis parking lot. Whoever had left it behind had wiped all the fingerprints from it. Mary was nowhere to be found. At the time of her disappearance, she lived in Duluth with her husband Raymond and their two teenage sons. As investigators searched for answers, questions began to swirl around the family's circumstances. 1 year after Mary vanished, Raymond relocated to California and rented out the family home. He was unable to sell the property outright until Mary was legally declared dead. Then came a series of events that would cast an even darker shadow over the case. In 1977, Raymond was arrested in California after shooting a female friend in the back. Remarkably, she survived. Investigators discovered that two weapons had been used during the attack, and both had their serial numbers filed away. Police admitted they could find no clear motive, describing themselves as baffled by the circumstances. A search of Raymond's belongings uncovered a military M1 carbine, several additional rifles, boxes of ammunition, blasting caps, a fuse, and what appeared to be part of a tear gas grenade launcher. You know, all the stuff we normally keep tucked away in the spare room closet. Raymond eventually pleaded guilty to assault with intent to commit murder. He only served 10 months in jail before being released on probation. In 1980, 7 years after Mary disappeared, she was officially declared dead. Raymond immediately moved to sell the Duluth home. The following year, a cleaner entered the now vacant residence and made a startling discovery: two cigar boxes that had been rigged as booby traps, designed to explode when opened. Authorities conducted a more thorough search. Beneath the porch, they found roughly 100 pounds of deteriorating dynamite along with blasting equipment. Raymond denied any involvement, claiming the explosives belonged to former tenants. Sure, Raymond, we all believe you. Just 1 year later, in 1982, Raymond died in Oakland, California. If he knew what happened to Mary on that August morning in 1973, he never shared it. More than 5 decades later, Mary's disappearance remains unsolved. No trace of her has ever been found, and no one has been charged. If you have any information about her case, please contact the Duluth Police Department at 218-730-5400. On June 17, 1975, 58-year-old Milda McQuillan set out on a trip to visit friends at their cabin. Driving her pea green 1968 Dodge, she left home and headed down East Bad Medicine Lake Road near Ponsford. Her destination was only 18 miles away, but Milda never arrived. A few miles from home, her car stalled along the road. Fortunately, a postal carrier who knew her happened to come by and helped get the vehicle running again. Later, with her destination nearly in sight, Milda made a wrong turn. Just 1 mile from her friend's cabin, she stopped to ask a truck driver for directions. That truck driver would become the last known person to see her alive. When Milda failed to arrive, concern eventually grew. 3 days later, her Dodge was discovered abandoned and stuck in the mud on an unused logging road. The location was strange. The vehicle sat about 100 feet off East Bad Medicine Lake Road in a heavily wooded, swampy area roughly 35 miles west of Detroit Lakes. Most puzzling of all, it was directly across the road from the cabin she had been trying to reach. Searchers immediately combed the surrounding woods. They looked through the swampy terrain, examined the roads, and searched for any sign that Milda had wandered away from her vehicle. They found nothing. 3 days later, more than 50 members of the National Guard were brought in to search the very same area. This time, searchers located two personal items: Milda's scarf and a belt. Both were reportedly hanging from a bush in plain sight. For Milda's family, the discovery raised more questions than answers. Her daughter has long wondered how such obvious items could have been missed during the initial search. She believes the possibility cannot be ruled out that the items were placed there after authorities had already searched the area. But the mystery didn't end there. According to Milda's daughter, the couple she had planned to visit never organized a search for her despite her unexplained absence. When one of the friends was interviewed by law enforcement 3 days after Milda vanished, An officer noticed that the man's clothing was unusually wet. When asked about it, he reportedly explained that he had been walking along the road. The officer wasn't convinced. In his opinion, the clothes appeared far too soaked for someone who had simply been walking roadside. He believed the man had likely been moving through tall grass or wooded terrain instead. You know, maybe going to plant evidence. Whether that observation was meaningful or merely coincidental has never been determined. More than half a century later, the forests around Bad Medicine Lake still guard their secrets. No trace of Milda McQuillan has ever been found. No one has been charged. No explanation has emerged. If you have any information about her case, please contact the Becker County Sheriff's Office at 218-847-2661. The last known sighting of 74-year-old Florence Hector came on May 10, 1976. A retired English teacher at East High School, Florence was living alone in Duluth and preparing for a brief trip to Minneapolis. She left her apartment and began the drive south, stopping at a gas station along the way. It would be the final confirmed sighting of her. Florence had reserved a hotel room in Minneapolis, but for reasons unknown, she left home a day earlier than her reservation required, and she never checked into the hotel. 2 weeks after Florence disappeared, her 1971 Oldsmobile Holiday was discovered abandoned in a downtown Minneapolis parking lot behind the Minneapolis Auditorium. Inside the trunk was her suitcase. The contents offered little insight into her plans. She had packed only enough clothing for a short trip, along with the medication she needed. There were no signs of a struggle inside or around the vehicle. There was, however, one small detail that stood out. Investigators found a cigarette butt at the scene, and Florence did not smoke. As authorities dug deeper into Florence's affairs, they uncovered yet another mystery. After her disappearance, a bank was appointed conservator of her estate. During a review of her finances, officials discovered that Florence possessed approximately $97,000 in securities. But, according to records, she should have owned nearly twice that amount. A substantial portion of her stocks and bonds had vanished. The investigation soon led to her slimy, no account stockbroker, Russell Conwell Moore. Moore eventually admitted that he had stolen Florence's securities. He confessed to forging her signature on 20 stock certificates worth more than $74,000 and transporting them to Switzerland. Despite admitting to the financial crimes, he insisted he knew nothing about Florence's disappearance. Authorities were skeptical, but proving otherwise would be another matter entirely. In 1977, Moore pleaded guilty to the illegal transportation of securities. He also pleaded guilty in a separate and unrelated case involving thousands of dollars worth of stolen model train equipment. Pick a lane, Russell. Together, the convictions resulted in a 25-year prison sentence. Over time, authorities came to believe that Florence had been murdered. But by whom? Was her disappearance connected to the missing securities? Or was the financial crime merely a coincidence that happened to intersect with an entirely different tragedy? 50 years later, those questions remain unanswered. If you have any information about Florence's case, please contact the Duluth Police Department at 218-730-5400. On the evening of July 11, 1982, 18-year-old Kevin Ellsworth and several friends reportedly crashed a wedding reception being held at the local Union Hall in International Falls, Minnesota. What began as a youthful prank turned into a disturbance, drawing unwanted attention and creating what witnesses later described as a bit of a ruckus. Sometime afterward, Kevin was seen leaving the area. At approximately 2:30 a.m., witnesses spotted him heading toward the town's bowling alley. One person later recalled Kevin making a strange remark before he disappeared into the night. "Anybody who stays around here is going to jail. Come with me to heaven." Whether that comment was a joke, a drunken statement, or something more troubling has never been determined. It would be the last confirmed sighting of him. As investigators attempted to reconstruct Kevin's final hours, another piece of information surfaced. Several people reported that Kevin had been sleeping in a basement room at the Rex Hotel that same night. Unfortunately, July 11th was also the night that the Rex Hotel caught fire and burned. For a time, it seemed possible that the mystery had been solved, that Kevin had been trapped inside and perished in the blaze. But when the ruins were examined, no remains matching Kevin were found. So if he wasn't in the hotel when it burned, where had he gone? Adding to the confusion was the discovery of Kevin's car, which was found parked across the street from the hotel. But the vehicle offered no obvious clues about his whereabouts and no indication of where he might have headed next. One witness claimed she saw Kevin walking around International Falls after the hotel fire, but that sighting was never confirmed. No additional witnesses came forward and no physical evidence supported that claim. No verified sightings of Kevin have ever been reported since. If you have any information about his disappearance, please contact the International Falls Police Department at 218-283-4416. On June 17, 1985, 19-year-old Cassandra Rhines called a friend to confirm that she would be attending her goddaughter's birthday party in Minneapolis. It was an ordinary conversation, and nothing seemed out of place. But when the celebration arrived, Cassandra never showed up. As the days passed, concern turned into fear. Family and friends waited for word from her, but none came. Cassandra had vanished without explanation. Years turned into decades with investigators no closer to knowing what happened to her. Then, in 2014, the case took a turn. An off-duty employee of the Lake County Sheriff's Office was in a secluded area of Gooseberry Falls State Park when human remains were discovered. The location was remote and heavily wooded, nearly 200 miles from where Cassandra had been living when she disappeared. Forensic testing eventually provided the answer investigators had been seeking for almost 30 years. The remains belonged to Cassandra Rhines. As investigators revisited the case, they focused on a man who appeared alongside Cassandra in an old photograph. They eventually learned that he had been living with Cassandra around the time that she had disappeared. The man was identified as Donald McSwain, but by the time investigators located him, he was already dead. Whether he held answers about Cassandra's final days or whether he had any involvement at all remains unknown. Nearly 40 years after Cassandra vanished, investigators know far more than they once did. They know where her life ended. They know her remains lay hidden in the wilderness of Minnesota's North Shore for almost 3 decades. But the most important question remains unanswered. Who took Cassandra Rhines to Gooseberry Falls State Park? If you have any information about her case, please contact the Lake County Sheriff's Office at 218-834-8385. On the morning of May 7, 1993, 40-year-old Linda Anger was supposedly headed to an appointment at the Olmsted County Courthouse in Rochester. According to her ex-husband, Dennis, he dropped her off there so she could meet with social services. It was the last time anyone claimed to have seen her. But from the very beginning, there were troubling questions about Dennis's account. Investigators were never able to confirm whether Linda actually had an appointment scheduled that day. No witnesses reported seeing her enter the courthouse. No one remembered seeing her in the parking lot. There was no verified evidence that she'd ever arrived at the building at all. At the time, Linda's life appeared to be moving toward a fresh start. She had recently returned to Minnesota from Arizona and was living with Dennis, his new wife, and the 2 sons she shared with him. The arrangement may have been unconventional, but Linda's focus was hoping to find a place of her own and establish a more independent life. There was no indication that she planned to leave voluntarily. She had not spoken about running away, disappearing, or harming herself. As investigators examined the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, attention soon turned toward the people closest to her. Dennis eventually became a person of interest in the case. One detail in particular raised eyebrows among investigators and family members alike. Within just 3 days of Linda's disappearance, Dennis and his wife had reportedly cleaned out Linda's bedroom at the home. For some, the timing seemed unusually quick for a woman who had only recently gone missing. Over the years, suspicions continued to linger. At least one of Linda's sons has publicly stated his belief that his father knew more than he admitted, or he may have been directly involved in what happened to his mother. Despite years of investigation, authorities never gathered enough evidence to bring charges against Dennis. In 2007, he died without ever being arrested or formally accused in connection with Linda's disappearance. Today, investigators believe Linda was likely the victim of homicide. Yet, no body has ever been found, no one has been charged, and no witness has come forward with a definitive account of what happened after that supposed trip to the courthouse. If you have any information, please contact the Olmsted County Sheriff's Department at 507-285-8308. In July of 1993, 19-year-old Holly Spangler set out for a walk in Moyer Park, a wooded area winding along 9 Mile Creek in Bloomington, Minnesota. It was around 5 p.m., still daylight, with people enjoying the park in the long days of summer. At some point during that walk, something horrible happened. When Holly failed to return home, her loved ones knew something was wrong. She was reported missing, and search efforts quickly got underway. Friends, family members, and law enforcement searched for any sign of the young woman who had seemingly vanished during a routine afternoon outing. 3 days later, the search came to a heartbreaking end. Holly's body was discovered in a marshy area of the park. She had been stabbed once in the chest. Due to what little evidence they had, investigators reached out to the public for help, and tips poured in. Leads were followed and witnesses were interviewed, but each promising avenue eventually reached a dead end. As the years passed, investigators began comparing Holly's murder to other violent crimes committed in the state, and one name repeatedly surfaced: Donald Blong. At the time of Holly's murder, Donald was living in Bloomington, and years later, he would become one of Minnesota's most notorious killers after being convicted of the 1999 abduction and murder of 19-year-old Katie Poyer. Because of the similarities investigators perceived, police questioned Donald about Holly's death, but according to investigators, he refused to provide clear answers and offered little useful information. Despite suspicions and speculation, authorities were never able to uncover any physical evidence connecting Donald to Holly's murder. He was never charged in the case and consistently denied involvement. When he died, he left behind no admission and no explanation. More than 3 decades later, Holly Spangler's murder remains unsolved. If you have any information, please contact the Bloomington Police Department at 952-563-4900. Ann Barbara Dunlap, 31, was temporarily staying at her parents' home in Minneapolis with her husband, Brad, when she disappeared on December 30th, 1995. According to Brad, Anne left the house that afternoon to go shopping at the Mall of America. But there was a problem. Investigators were never able to verify that Anne had actually been at the mall. As concern grew, friends and family searched for answers. Then, on New Year's Day of 1996, a group of Anne's friends made a troubling discovery. Her maroon 1987 Toyota Celica was sitting in the parking lot of a Minneapolis Kmart. The car was unlocked, but the keys were still inside. Investigators brought in a bloodhound to track her scent, and the dog followed a trail to the rear of the store before abruptly losing it. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Anne was still out there somewhere. Then police had the vehicle towed for a more thorough examination. What they found inside the trunk transformed a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. Anne's body had been hidden inside. She had been stabbed multiple times in the throat and neck, and her wedding ring was gone. There was no information on why the dogs couldn't track her in the trunk. Detectives naturally suspected Anne's husband, Brad, but he strongly denied any involvement in his wife's murder. He repeatedly described their relationship as happy and portrayed their marriage as nearly perfect. For years, investigators continued searching for evidence that could identify Anne's killer. And for years, the case remained unsolved. Then, in 2026, the investigation suddenly returned to the spotlight. The Hennepin County Attorney's Office convened a grand jury in an effort to gather testimony and potentially uncover new information about the long unsolved murder. Witnesses were called, and old relationships were scrutinized once again. Among the most startling revelations was testimony from a woman who stated that she had been having an affair with Brad Dunlap at the time of Anne's death, which makes Brad's claim that their marriage was nearly perfect seem a tad exaggerated. Whether the affair had any connection to Anne's murder remains unclear. The grand jury concluded, and there have been no arrests in Anne's murder. If you have any information, please contact the Minneapolis Police Department at 612-673-3000. On October 26, 1996, 40-year-old Veronica Safransky attended a Halloween party at Mick's Bar and Grill in Warren, Minnesota. She had gone with a friend and spent the evening enjoying the festivities among the crowd of costume partygoers. But sometime after midnight, everything changed. Around 12:30, Veronica's friend had gone to the bathroom, and when she came out, she realized she could no longer find Veronica inside the bar. What initially may have seemed like a simple separation among a crowded gathering soon became something far more alarming. Veronica had disappeared. As investigators began reconstructing her final node movements, multiple witnesses reported seeing her with a man named Kevin Skirvin. According to those accounts, the two left Mix together in Kevin's black Dodge Power Wagon pickup truck bearing Oregon license plates. It was the last confirmed sighting of Veronica. Days turned into weeks as search efforts intensified. Then, in late 1996, investigators recovered a troubling piece of evidence. Along a rural road approximately half a mile south of the intersection of Marshall County Roads 8 and 6, a belt believed to have been part of Veronica's Halloween costume was discovered. The find offered hope that investigators were getting closer to answers, but it led nowhere. As the years passed, attention continued to focus on Kevin. Investigators noted that he had a history of sexual assault convictions. Kevin acknowledged that he had left Mix with Veronica that night, but swore he didn't know what became of her afterward. The case remained largely stagnant for years. Then, nearly 3 decades after Veronica vanished, investigators returned to Kevin's property. On July 30th, 2025, law enforcement officers executed a large-scale search warrant at his rural Newfolden residence. During the operation, Kevin was arrested on an unrelated charge of being a felon or prohibited person in possession of ammunition. Authorities returned to search the property again in October 2025, but once again, no charges related to Veronica's disappearance followed. Today, nearly 30 years after she walked out of Mick's Bar and Grill, Veronica Safransky remains missing. If you have any information about her case, please contact the Marshall County Sheriff's Office at 218-745-5411. On the morning of September 23, 2000, two people walking along the shoreline of Worth Lake in Golden Valley made a disturbing discovery. Near the water's edge lay the body of a young woman. Police responded to the scene, believing they might be dealing with a tragic accident. At first glance, it appeared possible that the woman had drowned. She was fully clothed, but she carried no identification, leaving investigators unsure of who she was or how she had ended up there. It would not take long to learn her identity. The victim was 20-year-old Kiki Jefferson Moore. An autopsy determined that she hadn't drowned, but had been murdered, though the exact cause of death has never been released to the public. Investigators concluded that she had been killed elsewhere and transported to Worth Lake. The search for Kiki's killer began immediately. Not long after the murder, police arrested an unnamed 24-year-old man in connection with the case. Authorities confirmed that he and Kiki had known each other, though they never publicly disclosed the nature of their relationship. Investigators questioned the man extensively, searching for evidence that might connect him to the crime. But in the end, they were forced to release him. No charges were filed, and no public explanation was given. And once again, the investigation stalled. 26 years later, there are no clear answers as to who murdered Kiki. If you have any information about her case, please contact the Minneapolis Police Department at 612-673-3000. On the afternoon of June 14, 2003, Leanna Warner left her home in Chisholm and headed to a nearby friend's house to play. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon, and the trip should have only taken a few minutes. But when she arrived at the friend's house, no one was home. So Leanna turned around and started back. Somewhere along that short route, she vanished. Witnesses reported seeing her between 5 and 5:15 that evening. Those would become the last confirmed sightings of the little girl. When Leanna failed to return home, her mother, Kaylin Warner, became concerned. By 5:30, she was searching the neighborhood herself and asked local children to help her. The searchers found nothing. Between 8:40 and 9, Kaylin called police. What followed was one of the largest search efforts the area had ever seen. Law enforcement officers, volunteers, bloodhounds, and helicopters all descended on Chisholm. Searchers combed through woods, fields, yards, and abandoned properties. Every lead was pursued, and every possible clue was examined. But Leanna was nowhere to be found. Tracker dogs followed her scent for a distance before reaching the edge of a roadway. There, the trail abruptly ended, so it appeared possible that Leanna had entered a vehicle. As detectives worked to identify anyone suspicious in the area, reports surfaced about two unfamiliar men who had been seen in the neighborhood around the time Leanna disappeared. Despite extensive efforts, neither man was ever identified. Whether they were connected to Leanna's disappearance or merely happened to be in the area that day remains unknown. The investigation also led authorities to a 24-year-old man named Matthew James Curtis. In August 2003, Matthew was arrested on charges involving CSAM that were unrelated to Leanna's case. Because of the timing and nature of the allegations, investigators questioned him repeatedly about Leanna's disappearance, but he denied any involvement. Authorities searched for evidence linking him to the missing child and even processed his pickup truck for DNA and forensic evidence. In the end, investigators found nothing to indicate that Leanna had ever been inside the vehicle. Before he could appear in court on the unrelated charges, Curtis was found dead in September of 2003. His death was ruled a suicide. Ultimately, investigators concluded that there was no evidence connecting him to Leanna's disappearance. More than 2 decades later, authorities continue to believe that foul play was involved. Investigators have stated that Leanna's parents are not suspects. Neither parent was ever asked to take a polygraph. And law enforcement has consistently focused its attention elsewhere. In 2022, Leanna's mother, Kaylin, died after a battle with cancer. She spent nearly 19 years searching for answers about what happened to her daughter. Today, Leanna's father and her two half-sisters continue the search and continue to hope that someone, somewhere, knows what happened on that summer evening in 2003. If you have any information, please contact the Chisholm Police Department at 218-254-7915. Minnesota's lakes, forests, and river valleys have witnessed generations of history. They've also become the backdrop for mysteries that continue to linger long after headlines faded and investigations grew cold. For the families left behind, the passing of time has never lessened the need for answers. And for many of these cases, the hope remains that one new witness, one forgotten piece of evidence, or one fresh look at the facts could finally reveal the truth. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of 12 Unsolved. If you're so inclined, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment, and maybe even share it with someone you think might be interested in these cases. In our next episode of 12 Unsolved, we'll leave behind Minnesota's northern forest and glacial lakes and travel south to Mississippi, where winding bayous, sprawling river deltas, pine-covered hills, and the mighty Mississippi River have their own share of unsolved mysteries waiting to be explored. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, someone somewhere knows more than they're telling.